Does that title excite anyone? Oh, cool. I thought there might be one or two. Seems like that I was right. Just one or two. We've been in Hebrews, which is, I think, a surprise to no one. If you've been, I think most folks haven't missed many weeks lately, so you already know that. Let me try to sum up a little bit. We're in the central section of Hebrews, which runs from like the end of chapter 4 through the middle of chapter 10. It's like this one big section, and that's where we're at, right in the middle of it, a little closer to the end than the middle, which maybe you'll find refreshing. Last week we went through chapter 8. Tony preached on that, and it deals with how the new covenant is far better than the old one. So just to kind of maybe bring that to mind and kind of review, catch us up or whatever, and also just because I really like these verses, let's read it. So this is from the end of Hebrews 10. He's quoting Jeremiah 31. He says, "This is the covenant that I will decree with the house of Israel after those days, says the Lord. I'm putting my laws in their minds, and I will write them on their hearts. And I will be their God, and they will be my people. And they will not teach each one his fellow citizen and each his brother, saying, 'Hey, you should know the Lord,' because they will all know me, from the least of them to the greatest. For I will be merciful toward their wrongdoings, and I will remember their sins no longer." It's quoting from Jeremiah 31, one of three really key passages about this sort of thing in the Old Testament, passages that talk about what's going to be required for this to really work, that there's something fundamentally wrong with us inside, and so the transformation has to be there. Moses pointed it out first in Deuteronomy when he said that we had to have our hearts circumcised. And Jeremiah and Ezekiel took that and ran with it. Jeremiah talked about the law being written on our hearts, and Ezekiel talks about our hearts that are stone, and they need to be transformed and replaced with the heart of flesh. And yeah, there's this promise in the Old Testament that there's going to come something. God's going to do something in the future. And we know that was fulfilled in Jesus. And so that's the end of chapter 8. And before we keep going, though, I know that there's a lot in this central section. Even myself, as I'm studying or whatever each week, I'm like, man, yeah, where were we? Okay, where else is this? So just to kind of maybe help situate us, I have a map, also known as an outline. So this is that central section of Hebrews. I'll kind of work from the outside towards the middle, right? At the end and at the beginning. At the beginning, he's talking about how we have a sinless high priest who's gone into heaven, and at the end, he closes with hey, that high priest has taken us there too, right? And then the two major blocks within that are, one, how the Son, Jesus, is a better or a superior high priest than what the old covenant could offer. And then the second, letter B there, is that he also had a superior offering. He was a better high priest, and he offered a better offering. And there's a little transition in there. And you remember the stuff about Melchizedek and all that. We went through that a few weeks ago. And so here we are, right where that arrow is. That's where we're at. The last bit that I read of chapter 8, talking about how the new covenant was better than the old covenant. And now he starts talking about how the offering is better than the offerings under the old covenant. And if we were to zoom in a little bit into that section, we're right there in this introduction. And so he's going to talk about, in the beginning of chapter 9, he talks about the old covenant, the rules for worship, what they were about. Just briefly, he doesn't go into a lot, but he talks about where they were, the fact that it was a blood sacrifice, and what happened with those, like what effect did those sacrifices have. And he mentions those by way of introduction because later he's going to go on to talk about how Jesus offered a better sacrifice, and it was eternal, and it was in a better place too, a heavenly sacrifice. But that'll be in coming weeks. Right now, we're in that first bit, that introduction. And so, with that, let's launch into it. Hebrews 9. Let's read it. Now the first covenant had regulations for worship and the earthly sanctuary. He mentions two things, regulations for worship and regulations for the sanctuary, and he's going to talk about them in reverse order. First, the regulations for the sanctuary, and then get back to regulations for worship. Verse 2, this is the sanctuary bit. For a tent was prepared, the first one, in which were the lampstand and the table and the presentation of the loaves, which is called the holy place. And after the second curtain was a tent called the Holy of Holies, containing the golden incense altar and the Ark of the Covenant, covered on all sides with gold, in which were a jar containing the manna and the rod of Aaron that budded and the tablets of the covenant. And above it, that's the ark, were the cherubim of glory, overshadowing the mercy seat, about which it is not now possible to speak in detail. Writing letters back then was expensive, and he had a point to make, and he said, it's not possible right now to go into detail. I have 40 minutes. I'm going to go into a little more detail. It'll be worth it, but you got to hang with me. So, how many of you already know what he's talking about? You've heard of the tabernacle. You've heard of how it's set up. Yeah, it looks like most of you. You probably, yeah. If you haven't, you'll learn now. And if you've forgotten, hopefully this will remind you. But before I go on to that, I do want to point out two things here. Just one thing is that this part about the first one, verse 2, for a tent was prepared, the first one, in which the lampstand, and then after the second curtain was a tent. So he's talking about it like as if it was two tents. It was two rooms within a tent, but he just kind of, I don't know, it's kind of a weird way to put it, but that's what he's talking about. It was a single structure, but there's two rooms in it, and he's kind of talking about like there's this one tent and there's another tent behind it, but he's talking about the rooms. This will be important for later, but right now I just want to point that out, all right? And of course, the cherubim, if you don't know what those are, those are these. It's not the little angels with the wings and the bow. Those the little kid, the babies. Yeah, that's the cherubs. It's not that. Ezekiel, Isaiah. That never would have crossed their mind from what they saw. But in the ancient world, and the Israelites shared the culture of the people around them, right? They had the same kind of idea, is that deities were guarded by these beings that are usually have wings. Sometimes they're like the legs of this animal and the head of that animal or whatever. But they're, just think of them as like the heavenly bodyguards, like the throne room bouncers, maybe, right? And so that's the representation here in the tabernacle. There's these cherubim. Cherubim is the plural, one cherub, two cherubim, and they're guarding the space. All right. So here's a little visual for you. This is the tabernacle of Moses. It had this courtyard around it. See all those pillars there? Those were made of wood, and they had these bases that were, I think, bronze on the outside, silver on the inside, in the tent part. But yeah, there's this wall around it. Inside it, there's an altar. Brazen means made of bronze, so there's a bronze altar, and there's a laver. Laver is an old word for a big basin with water in it, where you can, wash up a little bit. And so the bronze basin is in between the altar and the front of the tent. And as you can see there, there's like a cutaway view of there's like several layers of fabric over this tent, right? And this tabernacle came about, right? Exodus 19, they meet God at Mount Sinai. God says, I want you to be my people, and I want you to be a kingdom of priests, and they say, yes, we'll do that. Everything that God's tell us to do, we'll do. And he starts giving them some of the basic rules, starts with the 10 Commandments, gives them a few more. And so that's kind of like the wedding ceremony, right? Let's get married. The people say yes. And so then God says, okay, let's move in together. The tabernacle. Because they can't stay by the mountain where God's presence up there in the fiery mountain the whole time. They're headed somewhere. So he has this portable tent that his idea is, my presence is going to be there. God is coming to dwell in their midst. So anyway, that's how why this is here. And so here's a zoomed in view of the tent itself. It's called the tent of meeting, mostly in Exodus and Leviticus, because it's where they would meet with God. And as you can see there's around the inside, there's also columns and curtains on the columns, and then a kind of a rain fly, we would say, over the rest of it, right? If you're a camper. There's this lampstand on the left. The whole thing, the entrance is towards the east, because that's the direction they headed out of the garden in Eden. They headed out towards the east. This tabernacle is representing going back to that garden space, the space where heaven and earth touched. So the doorway's in the east. And as you go in on the south side, so on your left, there's this menorah, a golden lampstand, solid gold, with all these, 7 lights on it and all these decorations on it. And then on the right, a table of the bread of the presence. The King James says the showbread. It's where they'd put, it was a golden wooden table covered in gold. They'd put loaves, 6 loaves in one row, 6 more loaves of bread in another row, representing the tribes. And then there's this altar of incense right in front of that. And then that veil, there's an outer veil and an inner veil. But that inner veil separates it. That's that second curtain, the second tent that the author of Hebrews is talking about. And the ark is in there. And you can see, maybe you can make out that there's two cherubim, kind of with their wings like this. We don't really know exactly what position they had their wings in, but they were kind of touching or something like that. So there you go. This is the tabernacle. If you were paying attention, the author of Hebrews says that the altar of incense was inside the veil with the ark. There's an ambiguity there in the Old Testament. It just says it's in front of the veil, but it's kind of ambiguous onto whether it's on the inside or the outside. I think it's more likely it was on the outside, but for reasons that are a rabbit trail. But the author of Hebrews thought, when he read his Bible, he thought, I think it's on the inside, and that's what he wrote about. Doesn't matter. The point is, it was there and part of all this. So, in that, I guess a few things that I want to point out there. One is those cherubim over the cover of the ark, called the mercy seat, the atonement cover. That just has these different names. But the Old Testament describes God appearing above that, like not on it, right, or in it. He's not a cherub. This is not an idol statue, but he's like above it in some kind of cloud or smoke. But those aren't the only cherub. That curtain, that inside curtain, has cherubim embroidered on it as well. and it's made of these colorful blue, purple, scarlet material and linen. So it kind of looks like the sky, right? Blue, purple, and scarlet, like maybe a sunset or a sunrise, some kind of combination. It's costly and in pretty colors that not just anybody had, but it's also just kind of this kind of multicolored, like, expanse type looking thing. And I could talk a lot about the symbolism of the different pieces of furniture. I'm not going to. I will point out a couple, three things. One is that the priests would go into that first room every day, and they were to serve and keep it, right? To work and to keep it. And one of their duties was to always make sure that lamp was lit. Another one was to offer incense on that altar twice a day, once in the morning, once in the evening. And there was another one, which is that bread would get changed out once a week. Every Sabbath, the bread would get changed out. So in this space where heaven and earth meet, where God's presence is there, we have perpetual light, we have perpetual food, and we have the prayers of the people rising up before God twice a day. So that's just some of the symbolism that I want to point out. But it's a symbolic representation of when we're in God's presence. That's what it's like. There's always light. There's no scarcity of food. God hears us, right? And so that's what this is supposed to symbolize. Am I boring anyone yet? Okay, good. All right. Let's go on to the next part of Hebrews. He says there's these regulations for worship and regulations for the sanctuary. And then he talks about the sanctuary. Now he starts talking about the worship. And he doesn't go into as much detail as I'm going into, not just because of, not wanting to take the space. I don't think he needed to take the space either for people that were like super familiar with the Old Testament, like his hearers were. But he goes on to say in verse 6, now these things, talking about the tabernacle, the two rooms, the tents, having been prepared in this way, the priests enter into the first tent continually as they accomplish their service. But only the high priest enters into the second tent once a year, not without blood, which he offers on behalf of himself and the sins of the people committed in ignorance. The Holy Spirit was making this clear, that the way into the holy place was not yet revealed while the first tent was still in existence, which was a symbol for the present time, in which both the gifts and the sacrifices which were offered were not able to perfect the worshiper with respect to conscience, concerning instead only food and drink and different washings, regulations of outward things imposed until the time of setting things right. So as I said before, they'd go into that first space every day, twice a day at least, for the incense. Any of the priests, right? Anybody of the line of Aaron, go in there. Once a year, the high priest only can go into the second room, the holy place, or the most holy place, or holy of holies. And there's a whole ritual around that we're going to talk about a little bit. It's called the Day of Atonement. But here's where that first tent, remember I told you to remember that first tent thing here. So when he says, some of your translations might say, for verse 8, the way into the holy place was not yet revealed while the first tabernacle was still in existence. The word in Greek is just tent, because that's what a tabernacle is. But because earlier he's talking about the first tent and the second tent, the first curtain, the second curtain. what's most likely here is that he's referring to the holy place, right? That's the barrier. If you want to get into the most holy place, well, you got to go through the holy place first, and guess what? Nobody gets to go in there except a certain few people. And you have to be born into it. You have to be in good physical, a good physical specimen, let's say. You can't have any blemish on you, and a few other things. And so that's what he's referring there. He says when he says that the Holy Spirit was making it clear that the way into the holy place wasn't yet revealed, because this first area, the holy place, was kind of still here, like showing us in physically, like what's actually the spiritual condition, that we can't go directly into God's presence, is kind of shown physically by this holy place, that you're not going to get in there and be able to go past into the holy place, most holy place. Did that make sense? And then when he says the present time, he's not talking about his time. He's talking about the concurrent time of when they had this tabernacle, right? For the priests, and he's going. And there was a temple later that replaced the tabernacle, but he's always been digging from the Torah mostly, and sometimes the Psalms, the author of Hebrews. So he's sticking with that. And lastly, I'll just point out there in verse 9 and 10 that he's saying, hey, this is showing us that the interior of human hearts was not dealt with by these old systems. They're only the exterior. And all the rituals had to do with exterior stuff, but it really couldn't change your heart. It could at best cover over temporarily. So, that's what he talks about. And then he goes on to, in the rest of chapter 9, to talk about how Christ brought something better. But to help appreciate that, and to... Leviticus is a really great book. And there's a long time that I've not gotten as much out of it as is there, I guess. But it is kind of daunting. And so I want to take some time to point out a few things here, maybe bring something to you that you hadn't thought of before, while we're able to meditate on this. All right. So, turned the page too soon. So at the beginning of Hebrews, there's 5 sacrifices that are mentioned. I have to have a couple here just to touch down on a few things, to point out some of what's going on. Really, I want to talk about the logic of the sacrifices, the atonement sacrifices in particular. There were 5, 3 of them you could make atonement with. 2 were just ways of saying thank you. These were ways of saying I'm sorry. The others were ways of saying thank you to God. And so the 2 offerings I have up there, the ascension is not a word we use much. I mean, if you're talking about Christ going up into the heavens, or if you're Catholic, Mary or something as well. But it's really churchy word. But ascend, maybe we use that word more. It just means going up, right? It's the going up offering. That's what the Hebrew word means. A lot of our translations say burnt offering. But it's an offering that goes up. But both of these offerings, the burnt offering and the purification or sin offering, they both make atonement, which the idea behind atonement, I'm not going into it a lot, but it's 2 things. One, it pays back something that it's owed. And 2, it covers over something. And those sound like really different things to us, but to the ancient Israelites, it's the same thing. It's just parts of the same thing. The animal had to be without blemish, so it had to be like when you go to the, if you ever watch those dog shows, right? And they want the dogs that win are like, for their category or for that breed, are like the classic perfect physical specimen of that species, right? Like all the features, they got to have the. And if you've ever watched it, I'm not watched them a lot, but yeah, they're standing the dog up there. They're looking at the line of all the stuff, the hair, and that breed should be all these ways, right? So that's kind of the idea when it says the animal needs to be without blemish, right? It can't be lame. It can't be have like one horn that goes around instead of normal. It has to be like yeah, that's a perfect looking goat or lamb or bull. And the idea is that it has to be that way in order to come into God's presence. But that's not the only thing that needs to happen for it to come into God's presence. But that's the first thing. Then they'd press one hand on the animal. That's it. There's nothing said for these sacrifices. But they press their hand on the animal. And that is a way of appointing the animal as my representative. There's some for these two sacrifices. There's one sacrifice in particular on the Day of Atonement where they would also confess the sins of the people onto it. But either way, the animal is representing you, or in that second case, representing the sins, you and your sins, right? Because this animal is about to go into God's presence. So this isn't, I'm going to, in these two sacrifices. So it's not, I'm going to put my sins on it and then I'm going to send it into God's presence. That's not really what should be done in God's presence. And so you're just saying, this is my representative. I can't go, but this animal has no blemish. It can go. And it's going to go in as my representative in, right? You would walk into that outer court. There's a curtain. And the first thing you would see was this altar of bronze with a fire on it that's always lit. And beyond that, a curtain of blue and purple and scarlet. You're seeing something that represents the entrance to Eden with the flaming sword and the cherub, right? That's what you're walking up to. And you have this animal with you, and you can't go past that altar. God's over there, but you can't go past. So you put your hand on this animal, and then it gets sacrificed. They kill it. They drain the blood. Depending on the sacrifice, they do different things. The burnt offering, they just throw the blood up against the altar, and then they burn the entire animal. Nothing else happens to any part of the animal. For the sin offering, they burn a certain part of it, some fat parts, and then they take the rest outside the camp to a clean place, a pure place, and burn the rest of it there. But the reason I have both of them up here, because that's the big difference. The sin offerings, there's also something done with the blood. Depending on whether it's like the priests or all the people that sin, the blood actually goes into that first room in the tent and gets sprinkled in there in front of the second veil. If you're just a regular Joe like you or me that are offering a sin offering, then it just gets put on the horns. That bronze altar had horns on the four sides of it, the four corners. And so they put some on there. I'm going somewhere with this, okay? Stick with me. So here's what I want you to see. I'm Moshe, Israelite, and I'm walking up to the tabernacle to offer a sacrifice. I can't go past this bronze altar. But this animal somehow can. And it can go past as my representative. But to go past, it has to be transformed through death. The idea, the logic behind the ascension or the going up offering is that this animal, as it's burned on the fire, turns into smoke and rises up in my place, up there where God is. Or in the case of the sin offering, the life is in the blood, as we'll talk about later, but you may be familiar with that verse from Leviticus 17. And so that blood goes into God's presence. So this is teaching me that to go into God's presence, I have to be fundamentally transformed, and it's going to look like death. To go into God's presence, I need to be fundamentally transformed, my very nature, and it's going to look like death. It is death. So when Paul says, it really struck me. I didn't think of this until while we were singing. But we sing about these things. I offer my life on your altar, a living sacrifice. When Paul says in Romans 12 to offer yourselves as a living sacrifice, that's what he's saying. That when I accept that Jesus died in my place, that he carried my sins, I die too. And I don't physically die yet. I'm a living sacrifice. But I am a sacrifice, and I have to be fundamentally transformed. And it looks like death, because all the things that I wanted and I thought were important, if they don't line up with what God wants and what he thinks are important, they got to go. It's the death of myself, the death of the things that I wanted to do. So that's the logic. So when Paul says, offer yourselves as living sacrifices, he's not getting that out of nowhere. He read his Bible, and he meditated on it. He said, yeah, that's what's going on when Jesus came. I get it now. Have to be fundamentally transformed. He says in 1 Corinthians, not all of us will sleep. He's talking about dying, but we will all be transformed. We're all going to have to be transformed somehow at the end of the age when Jesus comes again to get that new body, something for us to be able to go into his presence. And that's what the logic of the sacrifices teaches us. Now onto a special sacrifice, the Day of Atonement. I'm not going to go through the whole ritual, but once a year, the priest would offer a specific sacrifice in a certain way, just to be worthy to offer it, because he was about to go into the most holy place. He had to do a sacrifice just for himself and his family first, of a bull and a ram. And then he could go do the stuff for the people. And whereas most of the time, the high priest is wearing like all the garments, right? There was this robe, there was this ephod, which was like a special tunic. There was this breastplate with jewels on it, a turban, it's like a crown with this like golden plaque on it that says "Holy to the Lord." I mean, he's walking around. This is the new human that's going. The kings and queens of the garden that we forfeited. This is a return to that. But on this day, he takes off the breastplate and he just dressed. He's still in special clothes, but they're a lot plainer when he's doing this directly into God's presence. And I have just 4 verses here that I'm pulling out for you guys for me to point out some things about this. One is that first verse there that he's talking about the sacrifice that's for the people, right? There's the bull and the ram for the priest. Then when he takes the sacrifice for the people, it's 2 male goats as a sin offering and 1 ram as a burnt offering. How many animals are there in that sentence? Not a trick question. 2 goats and 1 ram. So it's 3 animals. How many sacrifices? How many offerings are there? Sorry. How many offerings are there? 2. So the 2 goats are 1 offering. That's what it says. All right. So when he goes, there's a whole procedure with the 2 goats. One of the goats gets killed. They take the blood into the sanctuary. First, he puts some fresh incense on the altar so that he won't come maybe direct. Somehow God limits himself, and this incense filters some of the raw power of being right next to God, and because he's about to go into the holy place for this kind of smoke screen. And then he takes this blood, and there's a whole ritual that they do with the goat that gets sacrificed. The other goat, they put their hands on it and send it out. They confess all their sins. The priest puts both hands on it, not just one. Confesses all the sins of Israel on it, and then sends it out into the wilderness, like the community garbage truck, right? All the sins out of here. So these 2 middle verses here, Leviticus 16:16, he shall make atonement for the sanctuary. It's not for the people. It's for the sanctuary. He's going to cover over something, repay something in the sanctuary. From what? The Israelites' impurities and from their transgressions for all their sins. So he must do for the tent of assembly, which dwells with them in the midst of their impurities. God's living in their midst. He wanted to come in and live in their midst. And the problem is the people are sinful, and not just sinful, but sometimes ritually impure. And somehow that vandalizes God's living room in the sanctuary. And it needs to be covered over. It needs to be atoned for. And so that's what this goat that goes, the blood that goes in there. And then the second one, as I said, puts 2 hands on the living goat's head, the double hand press, and he confesses over it all the Israelites' iniquities and transgressions and sins. It's all the bad words are there. Those are the three main Hebrew words that the Old Testament uses to talk about moral failure. It's iniquities, transgressions, and sin. I don't think that's coincidence that they say we're going to list the complete list here, everything that we've done in the last year. He puts it on the goat's head and sends it away into the desert with a man standing ready. There's a guy who's ready for the task. He's been appointed. They've figured out ahead, you're going to be the guy. And there's a whole ritual on what he has to do when he comes back and all this stuff. But that's the basics of it. And I want to point out, lastly, in the next chapter, there's a section where he's talking about don't drink blood, and this is the reason that's given. He says to the Israelites, you can't, whenever you eat something, don't drink any or eat any of the blood. And he says it's because the flesh's life is in the blood. That's why for the sin offering, this animal is somehow going in there in my stead, because its life is in the blood. Its life is somehow going in there in my place. And I have given it to you on the altar to make atonement for your lives, because it is the blood it, because it is the blood with the life that makes atonement. So the blood is a gift to the Israelites for them. It's not a demand from them. It's not, you need to appease me. I require these sacrifices. It's a gift. I'm giving you away to cover up for your impurities and your sin so that we can live together. It's a gift. They didn't see, to us, man, all of us, right, me included, no matter how long you sit with these chapters in this book, the Torah, you look at all the stuff they had to do, it seems like a lot, right? It seems like really burdensome. It's not really how they saw it. There's no indication in the Old Testament that they saw it as some big burden. It was like a gift. We can be near God. All we have to do is these things. Like, that's, I mean, they saw the thunder and the lightning and the smoke on the mountain, and they're like, we could be close to that without us killing us. Without it killing us, great, let's do it. And so he gives, this kind of just points that out. He gives the blood to them to make a sacrifice, an atonement. For God so loved the world that he gave. He gave. Jesus is that offering of the Day of Atonement. He's the New Testament authors and the early Christians saw both goats in what Jesus did. He went into the heavenly throne room as the blood sacrifice, like the first goat. But he was also executed outside the city in disgrace, like the second goat. Peter says he bore all our sins in his body on the tree. Chapter 16 of Leviticus is at the center of the center of the center of the entire Torah. If you look at like how it's structured from a literary point of view, it's all... The Hebrews liked doing that. They liked making things kind of a reverse symmetry. It's the thing they like to do. They do it all the time in the books. At the small level and at the big level, it's so intricate. But that's one of the things that I'm not going to explain why. We can talk about it later if you want to know. But it's really important. It's what it's all pointing to. So, there you go. That's what I wanted to tell you about those. It takes some work to like kind of ingest some of this stuff and like see what it's pointing to. But I'm so rewarded when I see these things. I hope you are too. It's like worth it. And we have to realize that God decided to reveal. He didn't just write a story in my language in my time. He decided to reveal himself through history, starting with a certain people group in their language and time. And we're in the middle of this story, and seeing how that is progressing, what things point to, is what forms us. This might sound like a lot of psychobabble to you, I don't know. But it's the truth of just how we think, our brains, how we work neurologically, is that we tell a story to ourselves about where we're at, what's wrong with the world, if there is something wrong, what's needed to fix it, what point in the story are we at, all that. And these symbols and reminders kind of help keep that in front of us. And it's good to know, this is what the New Testament authors were doing. They were reading their Old Testament in light of what Jesus had done, and that's how they came up with the New Testament, inspired by the Spirit. I'm not saying it was nothing, making light of it, but that's what they did. They said they saw, and I think there's more that God can reveal, show us as we continue to meditate on these things. So we'll be talking, Tony will be talking about more next week about what Jesus did and how it was better than these things. But to end, I want to bring us back to verses 8 and 9 of chapter 9. I have them there. And he's talking about how while the older system was in place, we couldn't access God directly because it couldn't perfect the worshiper with respect to conscience. Conscience is our awareness of moral good and bad, right? And it can't remove that, the old system. New system could. And George Guthrie, in his commentary on Hebrews, made I think a really good observation about that, which I have also on this slide. And he says that this outer room of the tabernacle that was preventing access to the inner room symbolizes the spiritual condition of the people. Their conscience, knowing that I did bad, also prevents me from access. And the old system couldn't do away with that. But the new one does and did. And so that's where I want to leave you with, or where I want to land the plane here tonight, is by saying that Jesus' death on the cross and what he did and everything that means did away with that barrier. But we're still capable of putting one back up. It is construction without a permit if you're trying to do that. You're not supposed to try to rebuild that room. Your conscience of, man, I know he died for me, but does he really know? Does he really know how bad I've been? Does he really know how long I've been struggling with this? Does he really know how just I'm fine 1 second and on a dime this sets me off and or whatever it is, right? Or are you trying to sew the veil back together by saying, yeah, I know he did that, but I don't know if I can. He must not really know. He forgave them, but I don't know about me. He forgives me. I still don't feel worthy to go in, so I'm just not going to. That's your conscience trying to build that holy place, build it back up, and say you can't go past this into the most holy place. But it is construction without a permit. And so, if you're there in any part of your life, I want to give an opportunity for prayer so that we can tear that down, do some demolition together. Really, God does the heavy lifting. You just have to say, I want to.